She was about to jump into the sea to escape her abusive ex. Then a stranger grabbed her hand. The rain felt like needles against Theresa's skin, but her hands didn't shake. They were unnervingly still as she gripped the rusted railing of the Blackwood Cliffs. It was exactly 11:14 p.m., the precise moment she had decided the world was too tilted to keep standing on. Behind her, in the luxury SUV idling on the shoulder, Gary was likely still checking his watch, waiting for her to cool off from their latest disagreement. "Get up and go," her own mind whispered, mimicking the many warnings she'd ignored from friends who had long since stopped calling. "He didn't love you, he colonized you." Theresa let go. She leaned into the salt-heavy air, her heart hammering one last, frantic rhythm against her ribs. But the freefall lasted only a second. A hand, cold, massive, and immovable, snapped around her wrist. Theresa's head lurched back, her eyes locking onto a face that shouldn't have been there. Across the jagged edge, James H. Blaser looked down at her, his expression as stoic as the stone he stood upon. He wasn't breathing hard, and his eyes weren't filled with the frantic panic of a savior. They were searching her face with the same polished, rehearsed concern Gary used before a blow. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Gary's voice echoed from the distance, smooth as silk, drifting from the car. But as the stranger's grip tightened, bruising, controlling, and absolute, Theresa looked into James's dark eyes and realized with a jolt of pure terror. She hadn't escaped the predator. She had simply changed cages. The transition from the ledge to the air felt like a release, a sudden shedding of the weight that Gary had spent years piling onto her shoulders. For a microsecond, Theresa was weightless, the roar of the Atlantic rising to meet her like a dark, final lullaby. Then the world jerked. A sharp, searing pain shot through her arm as her descent was violently halted. Her shoulder socket groaned under the sudden tension. She swung like a pendulum against the slick face of the cliff, the spray of the waves drenching her boots. Above her, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the midnight sky, was a man. He hadn't lunged or shouted. He simply stood there, his boots anchored in the mud, his hand a vice-like clamp around her wrist. "Not tonight," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that cut through the howling wind with terrifying clarity. Theresa looked up, her breath hitching in her throat. She expected to see a face twisted with the frantic effort of a hero, but the stranger's features were a mask of chilling composure. His grip wasn't the desperate hold of someone trying to save a life. It was the calculated restraint of someone claiming a prize. Behind him, the headlights of Gary's car swept across the grass, a predatory yellow eye searching for its lost prey. "Let go," Theresa choked out, her voice thin and ragged. "Just let me go." The stranger's fingers tightened, digging into her skin with a pressure that promised bruises by morning. He leaned over the edge, bringing his face closer to hers. Up close, his eyes were as cold and deep as the water below. "If I let you go, Gary Kent wins. He gets to be the widower. He gets the sympathy, the closure, and the clean slate." The mention of Gary's name hit Theresa harder than the cold. Her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. "How do you know?" "I know everything about the man who broke you, Theresa," the stranger interrupted. With a slow, disciplined strength that seemed impossible, he began to pull her upward. He didn't struggle with her weight. He moved with the mechanical precision of a machine. "And I know that if you jump, you're just doing his dirty work for him." As her chest cleared the ledge and he hauled her onto the wet grass, she collapsed in a heap, gasping for air that tasted of salt and iron. The stranger stood over her, his long coat snapping in the wind, his shadow stretching over her like a shroud. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Gary's voice drifted from the road, closer now, dripping with the faux tenderness that had always preceded her darkest hours. Theresa looked from the road to the stranger. James H. Blaser didn't move to hide. He simply looked down at her, a silent, powerful guardian who felt more dangerous than the man he was protecting her from. In that moment, the tilted world she had tried to escape didn't right itself. It simply spun in a new, darker direction. The transition from the wet, jagged edge of the cliff to the sterile warmth of the estate felt less like a rescue and more like a fever dream. When Theresa finally opened her eyes, the roar of the Atlantic had been replaced by the hum of a high-end climate control system. She was lying on a bed with linens so crisp they felt structural, in a room that smelled of expensive cedar and floor wax. For a moment, the stillness was terrifying. With Gary, silence was usually the precursor to a storm. Here, the silence felt heavy, like it was being enforced. She tried to sit up, but a sharp ache in her shoulder, the one James had nearly wrenched from its socket to save her, forced her back into the pillows. Her gaze drifted to the windows. They were floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of a manicured forest shrouded in morning mist. But as she looked closer, she noticed the subtle glint of reinforced polycarbonate and the thin, rhythmic pulse of a perimeter laser system embedded in the frames. This wasn't a bedroom, it was a vault. "You're awake," a voice said, coming from the shadowed corner of the room. Theresa bolted upright, ignoring the protest of her muscles. James H. Blaser sat in a leather armchair, a tablet in his hand, looking as though he hadn't slept or moved since he'd hauled her from the abyss. He had traded his salt-stained coat for a charcoal sweater that made him look less like a ghost and more like a corporate titan. Yet the coldness in his eyes remained unchanged. "Where am I?" Theresa's voice was a dry rasp. She clutched the duvet to her chest, her knuckles white. "A place where Gary Kent doesn't exist," James replied, his tone as flat as a dial tone. He stood up and walked toward the bed, his movements possessing a predatory grace. "You're in the Berkshire Highlands, my private residence. It's gated, guarded by a 24-hour security detail, and digitally scrubbed from every map in the public domain. You are, for the first time in 3 years, invisible." Theresa should have felt relief, but the way he said invisible made her skin crawl. It sounded less like safety and more like erasure. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me. You told me you knew about Gary, but that doesn't explain why you were there." James stopped at the foot of the bed, crossing his arms. "I've been tracking Gary's employer, a man who uses small-time predators like your ex to move liquid assets across state lines. Gary isn't just a monster, Theresa. He's a low-level courier who got sloppy because he was too busy enjoying your slow destruction to notice he was being watched. I was there to intercept his phone. I didn't expect to find him watching his girlfriend try to become a statistic." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, transparent evidence bag. Inside was Theresa's phone, the screen cracked but the battery light glowing. "He took this from you 2 weeks ago, didn't he? He wanted to make sure you couldn't call for help. I took it back while he was busy deciding whether to call the police or just drive home and order a pizza." Theresa stared at the device. It was her entire life, her contacts, her bank apps, the photos of the woman she used to be before she met Gary at that gallery opening. "I need to leave," she said suddenly, swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was heated, another luxurious detail that felt like a trap. "I can't stay here. I'll go to a shelter. You'll be dead within 48 hours, James interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, which made the statement even more chilling. Gary's people, the people he really works for, don't like loose ends. If they think you know anything about the courier routes, they'll find you. A shelter is just a target with a different name." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, mirroring the moment on the cliff. He reached out, not to touch her, but to set her phone on the nightstand. His hand hovered there for a second, and Theresa saw the faint, jagged scar running across his knuckles. a mark of a different kind of violence than Gary's. You wanted to escape the world because it felt tilted, James said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I'm offering you a way to level it. But in this house, there is only one rule: total transparency. I provide the walls, the guards, and the legal shield that will eventually bury Gary Kent. In exchange, you tell me everything he ever whispered in his sleep. Theresa looked at the reinforced windows, then back at the man who had traded her death for a debt she couldn't yet calculate. The guardian angel sitting across from her didn't want her heart or her love. He wanted her information. He wanted her as a witness. The isolation hadn't happened with a locked door, but with a series of soft, reasonable suggestions. It started with her friends. I don't think Sarah really appreciates you, Theresa, Gary would say after a dinner party, his voice dripping with protective concern. Did you see how she talked over you? You deserve people who value your voice. One by one, the people who could have spotted the red flags were trimmed away, replaced by the suffocating, all-consuming presence of Gary's love. He had convinced her to sell her apartment, suggesting they find a place together that was ours, not just yours. He had taken over the management of her family's charitable trust, claiming he wanted to lift the burden of paperwork from her shoulders so she could focus on her art. Every move was framed as a gift, a way to make her life easier, until she woke up one morning and realized she no longer had a key to her own finances or a phone number for someone who wasn't on Gary's payroll. The mask hadn't slipped all at once. It had cracked in tiny, jagged lines. The first time he raised his voice, it was because she had stayed out 20 minutes late at a grocery store. He hadn't been angry, he told her. He had been terrified that something had happened to her. He had wept, clutching her hands, making her feel like her independence was an act of cruelty against his heart. By the time the psychological control turned physical, Theresa was already a ghost in her own life. She remembered the night the perfect smile she had fallen for at the gallery turned into a snarl. She had asked about a missing statement from the trust, a simple question that shattered the illusion. Gary hadn't hit her then. He had simply stood in the doorway, blocking her exit, and told her that without him, she was nothing but a wealthy mark waiting to be devoured. He had made her believe that the world outside their door was a predatory, dangerous place, and that only he could keep her safe. It was the ultimate irony. He had spent years making her fear the shadows, only for her to realize that the most dangerous thing in the world was the man holding her hand. The cliffside hadn't been an impulsive choice. It had been the final, logical step of a woman who had been boxed into a corner so small she could no longer breathe. She had believed that the only way to truly get up and go was to leave the physical world entirely. She had stood on that ledge not because she wanted to die, but because she couldn't figure out how to live in the cage Gary had built. Now, lying in a bed that cost more than her first car, Theresa realized that James Blaser was using the exact same playbook, just with different motives. Gary had used loving concern to isolate her. James was using professional protection. Gary wanted her money. James wanted her secrets. As the morning sun began to creep through the reinforced windows, Theresa felt the familiar, cold weight of being a project rather than a person. She closed her eyes, the memory of Gary's sandalwood scent mixing with the smell of James's cedar-lined room, and for the first time, she stopped feeling like a victim. If she was the perfect mark, as James had called her, it meant she knew exactly how predators thought. And if she was going to survive the Berkshire Highlands, she would have to stop trying to be saved and start learning how to hunt. The smell of coffee, dark and acidic, pulled Theresa toward the small sitting area of her suite. James was already there, standing by a sideboard, his back to her. He didn't turn when she entered, yet he spoke with the uncanny timing of a man who tracked movement for a living. You don't eat enough. My staff said you barely touched the tray they brought. He turned, holding a porcelain cup with a hand that looked far too large for such a delicate object. Starving yourself is a slow way to finish what the cliff started. I'd prefer you sharp. Theresa sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, her body still coiled with the instinct to flee. You keep talking about what you prefer. You've told me who Gary works for, but you haven't told me who you are, James. People don't just happen to be standing on private cliffs at midnight with a debt of honor on their minds. James set the cup down and leaned against the mahogany desk, his shadow lengthening across the rug. I run a firm that specializes in the recovery of things that shouldn't be lost. Sometimes that's capital. Sometimes it's people who have been submerged by men like Gary Kent. In your world, they call it security consulting. In mine, it's called balancing the scales. He reached for a leather folder on the desk and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. It landed with a heavy thud. I've been tracking a network known as the Vanguard Group. They're a conglomerate of clean businesses that serve as a front for high-end money laundering. Gary wasn't just your boyfriend, Theresa. He was their primary conduit for moving physical assets. Diamonds, bearer bonds, hard currency. Under the guise of your family's charitable deliveries. Every time you thought you were going on a romantic getaway to the coast, you were actually sitting on $5 million of untraceable debt. Theresa felt the air leave her lungs. The spontaneous trips, the way Gary always insisted on packing the trunk himself, the way he would disappear for an hour to get gas while she waited in the car. It all clicked into place with a sickening precision. I wasn't looking for you, James continued, his voice devoid of pity. I was looking for the ledger Gary was supposed to hand over 2 nights ago. He didn't show. I tracked his GPS to that cliffside, expecting a dead drop. Instead, I found him watching you. He wasn't going to stop you, Theresa. He was waiting for the splash so he could report a tragic suicide, claim your remaining estate, and retire on the Vanguard's gratitude. So you saved me to get to the ledger, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the folder. I'm just a witness. You're more than a witness. You're the only person who has been inside his inner circle for 3 years. You've seen the names of the people he met. You've heard the phone calls he thought you were too fragile to understand. You are the structural weakness in a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. James walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. I didn't pull you up because I'm a good man. I pulled you up because I don't like waste. And throwing away a life like yours to satisfy a parasite like Kent is a waste I couldn't permit. The honesty of his coldness was almost refreshing compared to Gary's suffocating warmth. James wasn't pretending to love her. He was assessing her value. What is the debt? She asked, looking up at him. The Vanguard Group is moving to replace Gary. They know he's compromised, and they'll come for you to ensure you don't talk to the feds. I can make them go away. I can provide the dark justice the law is too slow to manage. I can ensure Gary Kent spends the rest of his life in a hole so deep he forgets the color of the sky. James paused, his eyes narrowing. But my services aren't paid in currency. They're paid in loyalty. If I keep you alive, you belong to the mission. You tell me everything. You point out the faces. And when the time comes, you stand where I tell you to stand. Theresa looked at her hands. They were still bruised from his grip on the cliff, a physical reminder of the price of her life. She was traded from one master to another, but as she looked at the evidence of Gary's betrayal in the folder, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years flickered to life. It wasn't hope, it was rage. He took everything, she said, her voice finally steady. My family, my money, my mind. If you can help me take it back, I don't care what the debt is. James nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture. Then stopped sitting like a victim. We start tomorrow. There are names in Gary's logs that I need you to identify. From this moment on, Theresa, you aren't the mark. You're the bait. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. And Theresa? Don't think about the sea anymore. It's far too cold for someone with as much fire as you're starting to show. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the folder and the cold, bright light of a new, dangerous purpose. The following morning, the luxury of the estate began to peel away, revealing the cold, industrial bone beneath. Theresa was led from her suite not by James, but by a silent, broad-shouldered man in a tactical vest who navigated the hallways with a jarring military efficiency. For a second, Theresa felt a rush of utility, a sense that she was finally fighting back. But then she looked at James's face in the reflection of the monitor. There was no joy in his expression, only a calculating hunger. He wasn't helping her reclaim her life. He was using her memories as a roadmap for his own conquest. A chime echoed through the room, and one of the technicians spoke up. "Sir, we have movement at the downtown safe house." Kent's vehicle just pulled into the garage. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. James walked toward the main screen, his posture straightening. "Bring it up. Thermal only." Theresa watched as the screen shifted to a ghostly orange and blue. She saw the heat signature of a car, the car where she had spent so many hours in silent terror, and then the small, flickering heat of a man stepping out. It was Gary. Even in a thermal blur, she recognized the way he adjusted his jacket, that arrogant tilt of his head. "Should we move in?" the technician asked. "No," James said, his eyes fixed on the heat signature. "Let him think he's safe. Let him reach out to the vanguard for his payout. I want him to feel the walls closing in before we take him. I want him to look for an exit and find nothing but me." The cruelty in James's voice was sophisticated, a sharp contrast to Gary's blunt, physical threats. Gary broke things because he was angry. James broke things because it was a strategic necessity. He thrived on this, the surveillance, the leverage, the total control over another human being's movements. Theresa looked away from the screen, her heart hammering. She realized then that she hadn't been rescued by a hero. She had been intercepted by a more powerful predator. James had pulled her from the sea not out of mercy, but because she was a weapon he could point at his enemies. "You're enjoying this," she said, her voice louder than she intended. The room went silent. The technicians didn't look up, but their typing slowed. James turned slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the metal floor. "I enjoy efficiency, Theresa," he said, stopping inches from her. "I enjoy seeing a world that is broken being put back together according to my design. Gary Kent tried to destroy you to feed his ego. I am using you to destroy an empire. There is a difference." "Is there?" she challenged, her voice trembling. "You told me the only rule was transparency, but you're the one in the dark. You see everything, you control everything, and everyone in this room is just a tool for your design." James reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, a gesture that could have been tender if his eyes hadn't been so cold. "The world is tilted, Theresa. People like you either fall off the edge, or you find someone strong enough to hold the world steady for you. I am holding it steady. Don't mistake the grip for the cage." He pulled his hand away and turned back to the screens. "Keep working. We have 3 more art foundations to cross-reference before lunch." As Theresa turned back to the faces on the monitor, she realized the terrifying truth of her situation. She was no longer afraid of Gary. Gary was a ghost, a heat signature on a screen. The real danger was the man standing behind her, the one who had saved her life only to make her a part of his own dark machinery. She wasn't just the bait anymore. She was becoming a mirror of the man who held her hand. The transition from the high-tech war room to the cold reality of violence began not with a bang, but with a flicker. Theresa was back in her suite, staring at the reinforced windows as the afternoon light died behind the trees, when the rhythmic pulse of the perimeter lasers simply stopped. For 3 seconds, the estate was plunged into a vacuum of silence so absolute it felt physical. Then the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the mahogany walls in a haunting, clinical red. Theresa's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She moved toward the door, her hand hovering over the handle, when it was suddenly wrenched open from the other side. James stood there, his charcoal sweater replaced by a tactical jacket, a suppressed handgun held with a casual, terrifying familiarity. He didn't look frantic. He looked bored, like a man interrupted during a tedious meeting. "Stay away from the glass," he said, his voice a low, vibrating command. He grabbed her by the arm, that same firm, bruising grip, and pulled her into the center of the room, away from the panoramic view of the forest. "Is it him?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it Gary?" "Gary doesn't have the stomach for this," James replied, his eyes scanning the monitors on the wall that were now flickering with static. "This is the Vanguard. They didn't like that their courier's GPS ended at my front gate. They've sent a cleanup crew to see if the asset is still viable." A soft thwip-thwip sound echoed from the floor below, the muffled cough of suppressed gunfire. It was a silent, clinical sound, far more disturbing than a loud explosion. It was the sound of professional erasure. Theresa realized with a jolt of terror that the guards James had boasted about were currently dying in the hallways to protect a woman they didn't know. "They're inside, aren't they?" Theresa asked, her breath hitching. James didn't answer. He pressed a button on a small comms unit at his collar. "Sector 4 is compromised. Vent the crawl spaces and transition to secondary positions. Do not engage unless you have a clear line of sight. I want one alive." He turned back to Theresa, his expression unreadable in the red light. "The safe house has been breached because Gary Kent was sloppy enough to leave a signature in your phone's metadata. They traced the handshake when I powered it up in the war room. They don't just want you, Theresa. They want to know who I am. So I'm the reason they're here," she said, a wave of guilt washing over her. "I'm the one who brought the storm to your door." James stepped closer, his shadow stretching over her like a shroud. "You didn't bring the storm. You are the storm, and they are trying to catch lightning in a bottle." Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door to the suite groaned. A small, black tube slid under the gap, a snake-like camera lens. James didn't hesitate. He fired 2 rounds through the wood, the suppressed pops sounding like heavy raindrops hitting a tin roof. A muffled grunt followed, then the sound of a body hitting the floor. James moved with a mechanical precision that made Theresa's blood run cold. He didn't flinch, didn't breathe hard. He simply waited. The silence returned, thicker than before. Then, the window, the reinforced, unbreakable polycarbonate, shattered as a flashbang grenade punched through. The world turned into a white, screaming void. Theresa fell to her knees, her hands over her ears, her vision fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Through the haze, she saw shadows moving, figures in black tactical gear dropping from the ceiling joists. She saw the muzzle flashes from James's gun, silent sparks in the chaos. James didn't retreat. He moved toward the intruders, his silhouette a dark, lethal shape against the white light. He fought with a ruthless efficiency, using his weapon as a bludgeon when the quarters became too tight. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. By the time Theresa's hearing returned, the room was a wreckage of broken glass and expensive cedar. 2 men lay motionless on the rug, their blood dark and oily in the emergency light. James stood over a 3rd man who was clutching a shattered shoulder, his boots anchored in the man's chest. James looked over his shoulder at Theresa. He wasn't checking to see if she was hurt. He was checking to see if she was still a viable witness. His face was splattered with a fine mist of red, his eyes as cold and deep as the sea she had tried to jump into. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked. The words were Gary's, but the delivery was pure James H. Blaser, a chilling reminder that her savior was a man who thrived on this level of carnage. He didn't wait for her answer. He reached down, grabbed the wounded intruder by the collar, and began to drag him toward the door like a bag of refuse. "The breach is contained," James said into his comms. "Secure the perimeter. I have a guest who needs to talk." He stopped at the doorway, looking back at Theresa, who was still huddled on the floor amidst the glass. "Pack your things. We're moving to the secondary location. This house is no longer a vault. It's a crime scene." As he walked out, leaving her alone in the ruined suite, Theresa looked at the shattered window. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of pine and cordite. She realized then that James hadn't saved her from the tilted world. He had simply brought her deeper into its axis, where the only thing more dangerous than the men hunting her was the man holding her hand. The secondary location was a brutalist structure of concrete and glass tucked into the crags of a forgotten coastline. If the first estate had been a gilded cage, this was a sharpening stone. There were no heated floors here, no cedar-scented linens. Only the persistent, rhythmic thrum of the tide hitting the rocks below and the smell of salt and gun oil. James didn't give Theresa time to process the trauma of the breach. He moved with a restless, driving energy that demanded she keep pace or be left behind in the dark. On their first morning at the new site, he didn't meet her in a war room. He met her in a sparse, mirrored gym that felt cold enough to see her breath. "Gary Kent didn't just take your money, Theresa. He took your instinct," James said, not looking at her as he wrapped his hands in black athletic tape. "He taught you to ignore the itch at the back of your neck. He taught you that your fear was paranoia and your boundaries were selfishness. To the vanguard, that makes you a soft target. To me, it makes you a liability." He stepped toward her, his presence filling the mirrored room until she felt as small as she had on the cliffside. "We aren't going to learn how to fight. We are going to learn how to see. A predator doesn't strike at random. They look for the flicker of hesitation. They look for the person who says, 'sorry,' when someone else bumps into them." The training was grueling, but not in the way Theresa expected. It was a psychological flaying. James would stand in her space, forcing her to maintain eye contact while he dissected her past. He made her recount the smallest details of Gary's manipulation. The specific tone of his voice, the way he shifted his weight before an outburst, the subtle tells of his lies. "When he told you he was working late, where did he look?" James barked, circling her like a wolf. The floor. "He always adjusted his cufflinks," Theresa whispered, her heart racing. Again, louder. "Do not look away from me." He looked at the floor. He touched his left cufflink. "Good," James said, his voice dropping to a low hum. "That wasn't love, Theresa. That was a performance. And every time you saw it and stayed silent, you gave him another inch of your life. Now, look at me and tell me when I'm lying." He began to tell her stories, some about his childhood in the city, others about the dark work he did for the recovery firm. He mixed truth with fabrication, watching her pupils, her breathing, the tension in her jaw. He was teaching her the anatomy of a lie, showing her how to spot the micro-expressions that even a professional like Gary couldn't fully hide. By the second week, the training shifted to the physical. He taught her how to use her surroundings, how to turn a perfect mark appearance into a weapon. He showed her how to use the weight of a man's own momentum against him. But more importantly, he taught her how to breathe through the panic. "Panic is a luxury you can no longer afford," James said, pinning her against the padded wall during a sparring session. His forearm was pressed against her collarbone. Not enough to choke her, but enough to remind her of her vulnerability. "When the adrenaline hits, your vision narrows. You lose the periphery. That's when they kill you. Breathe. Expand your field. Tell me what's behind me." Theresa gasped for air, her eyes stinging with sweat. She forced herself to look past his shoulder, to the reflection in the mirrors. A fire extinguisher, 3 meters back. The door is slightly ajar. James let go, stepping back with a rare, curt nod of approval. You're starting to occupy your own skin again. As the days bled together, the dynamic between them shifted. Theresa found herself no longer shrinking from his touch or his commands. She was absorbing his coldness, using it as armor. She watched him when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he checked the perimeter 4 times a night, the way he sat with his back to the wall, the way he never truly seemed to rest. He was a man who lived in a state of perpetual combat, and for the first time she didn't find it terrifying. She found it necessary. One evening, after a particularly long session of analyzing Vanguard courier routes, James handed her a glass of water. His fingers brushed hers, and for a fleeting second, the stoic mask he wore seemed to soften. "You have a natural aptitude for this, Theresa," he said quietly. "Most people want to forget the monster. You're learning to study it." "I don't have a choice," she replied, her voice firmer than it had been since the cliff. "If I don't study it, I'll always be waiting for the next hand to grab my wrist." James looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering light of the monitors. The hand that grabs you doesn't always want to pull you down. Sometimes it's just making sure you don't walk back to the edge on your own. "And what if I don't want anyone holding me at all?" she challenged. James didn't flinch. He simply turned back to the screen, the cold commander returning in an instant. "Then you'd better learn to stand very, very still, because Gary found out where we're going next. He's reached out to the jeweler. They think you're a broken woman hiding in a cellar. Let them keep thinking that." Theresa looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back wasn't the one who had tried to jump. Her shoulders were square, her gaze was level, and for the first time, the tilted world felt like something she could finally grab and pull back into place. The salt air was thick and heavy, pressing against the glass of the observation deck like a physical weight. Theresa stood by the window, watching the whitecaps break against the jagged rocks below. She no longer saw a place to fall. She saw a tactical perimeter. She was tracing the shadows on the beach, looking for movement, when the heavy door behind her hissed open. James didn't go to the monitors or the maps. He walked straight to the railing overlooking the darkened surf, his silhouette sharp and uncompromising. He waited for her to join him, his presence a silent demand for her attention. "The jeweler has moved Gary to a penthouse in the city," James said, his voice barely rising above the rhythmic thrum of the tide. "They're preparing to scrub him. The Vanguard doesn't like the attention he's brought, and they certainly don't like that he lost their asset. To them, Gary is a leak that needs to be plugged. To me, he is the last thread connecting you to a world that wants you dead." Theresa turned to face him, her jaw set. "You said you could make him disappear. You said you could give me justice." "I can," James replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "I have the team staged. I have the digital signatures ready to frame him for the very embezzlement he tried to pin on you. I can ensure that Gary N. Kent is removed from the board entirely, not just legally but physically. He will go to a place where the Vanguard can't find him and where he can never breathe your name again." He stepped closer, the coldness of his demeanor softening into something more dangerous. "An offer. But justice of this magnitude isn't a gift, Theresa. It's an investment. My organization doesn't operate on charity, and we don't leave survivors to wander back into the reach of the enemy. If I do this, if I erase Gary and bury the Vanguard's interest in you, the debt is total." "You want a lifetime of service," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a sentence. "I want your mind," James said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. "I've watched you these last few weeks. You have an analytical coldness that most of my operatives spend years trying to cultivate. You lived with a predator and learned his heartbeat. You can see the lies before they're spoken. That kind of insight is invaluable to the work I do." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. The deal is this. I make Gary disappear tonight. In return, you join the firm. You move from being the mark to being the architect. You will live under a new identity, in a world I control, doing work that most people don't even believe exists. You will never be a victim again, but you will also never be free of the mission. You will owe this organization your life, because I am the one giving it back to you. Theresa looked back at the ocean. The tilted world James had described was finally coming into focus. She realized that this was the choice she had been moving toward since the moment his hand snapped around her wrist. Gary offered her a life of beautiful lies that ended in a cage of fear. James was offering her a life of cold truths that ended in a cage of power. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice steady. "Then I drive you to the nearest city, give you $10,000 in cash, and wish you luck," James said, his expression returning to its stoic, professional mask. "But we both know how that story ends. Within 48 hours, the jeweler's men will find you. You'll be back on a ledge, and this time, there won't be anyone there to catch you." The silence that followed was visceral. Theresa felt the weight of her old life, the isolation, the gaslighting, the paralyzing fear, colliding with the potential of this new, shadow-filled existence. She thought of Gary's perfect teeth and his rehearsed concern, then looked at James's scarred knuckles and his honest, brutal transparency. She wasn't the woman who had stood on the Blackwood Cliffs anymore. That woman had wanted to disappear to end the pain. The woman standing here wanted to disappear to become something the world should be afraid of. "You said Gary was a low-level predator," Theresa said, looking James directly in the eye. "If I take this deal, will I be the one who hunts the high-level ones?" A ghost of a smile flitted across James's face, a sharp, lethal expression that finally reached his eyes. "You'll be the one who ensures they never even see the hit coming." Theresa took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs with a cold, sharp clarity. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His grip was firm, controlling, and absolute, but for the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a partner in a very dark business. "Make him disappear," she said. James nodded once, the commander returning in an instant. He tapped his headset. "Alpha Team, you are green. Proceed to the penthouse. Clean sweep. And tell the jeweler that the asset has officially been liquidated." As he led her back toward the war room, Theresa felt the final anchor of her old life slip away into the dark water below. She was no longer Theresa C. Brown, the victim of Gary Kent. She was a debt of honor, a rising shadow, and she was finally ready to play the long game. The penthouse was a glass cage suspended 40 stories above the city, a monument to the stolen wealth Gary had so meticulously curated. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and filtered air, a sterile imitation of the luxury they had once shared. Theresa stood in the center of the marble foyer, her silhouette reflected in the polished surfaces. She wasn't wearing the soft silk Gary preferred. She was dressed in a structured, midnight blue suit that felt like armor. Behind her, hidden in the shadows of the service corridor, James was a silent ghost. He had let her enter alone, a test of the stoic mask he had spent weeks forging. He was the safety catch on the weapon she had become, present only in the low hum of the earpiece nestled against her jaw. "He's moving," James's voice crackled, cold and distant. "Remember the tilt, Theresa. Don't let him right the world." Gary stepped out from the library, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked exactly as she remembered, the tailored suit, the perfectly coiffed hair, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But as he saw her, the practiced mask of the grieving partner faltered. For a split second, pure, unadulterated shock flickered across his face before he smoothed it over with a rehearsed look of relief. "Theresa," he breathed, stepping toward her with his arms outstretched. My God, I thought. The police said you went over the edge. I've been in agony. Theresa didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched the way his left hand twitched toward his cufflink. The tell James had taught her to hunt. The police didn't find a body, Gary. You of all people should know how difficult it is to get rid of a loose end when the sea doesn't cooperate. Gary stopped, his arms dropping to his sides. The sweetheart persona was evaporating, replaced by the sharp, calculating predator she now recognized. I don't know what you're talking about. You were depressed. You were unstable. I've been trying to protect your reputation. You've been trying to protect your payout, Theresa corrected. Her voice as flat and clinical as James's. The Vanguard Group doesn't like sloppy couriers, Gary, and they certainly don't like it when their widower is being investigated for the $2.7 million missing from the Richardson Trust. The mention of the specific figure, the one James had uncovered in the war room, hit Gary like a physical blow. His face reddened, the veneer of the charming lover finally shattering. You think you can walk in here and threaten me? You're nothing without me. You're a mark, Theresa. A beautiful, empty-headed mark who I rescued from a boring life. Is that what you told the jeweler? Theresa asked, stepping into his space. She felt no fear, only a cold, vibrating clarity. That I was too fragile to notice the gold lighter in the glove box? Or the way you used my father's charity to move diamonds? Gary lunged, his hand snapping out to grab her throat. But Theresa didn't flinch. She used his own momentum, stepping to the side and catching his wrist in a grip that mirrored James's on the cliff. She twisted, forcing him down onto his knees on the cold marble. Don't, she whispered, her face inches from his. I'm not the woman you left on that ledge. Enough, a new voice commanded. James stepped out from the shadows, his suppressed handgun raised with a terrifyingly casual precision. He didn't look at Gary. His eyes were fixed on Theresa, evaluating her pulse, her posture, her resolve. Gary looked from Theresa to James, his eyes widening as he recognized the predator higher up the food chain. Who the hell are you? Blaser? You're the one who's been bleeding my accounts. I'm the debt collector, James said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. And you, Gary, are a deficit that needs to be cleared. The three-way standoff was a study in power. Gary was on his knees, trapped between the woman he had broken and the man who had rebuilt her. James held the life of the courier in his hands, but he was waiting for Theresa to decide how the world would be balanced. He's a leak, James, Theresa said, her voice steady as she looked down at the man who had once been her entire world. If we let the Vanguard have him, he'll talk. He'll tell them about the Berkshire estate. He'll tell them about you. Gary looked up at her, a desperate, pathetic hope flickering in his eyes. Theresa, please, I can help you. I know where the rest of the money is. We can go back to how it was. Theresa looked at the hand she was holding, the hand that had once led her to the edge of an abyss. She let go, not out of mercy, but out of a profound sense of disgust. She stood tall, her shadow falling over him. There is no going back, Gary. You made sure of that when you watched me jump. She turned her back on him, looking toward James. The stoic mask was perfect. Her face conveyed nothing but the cold, analytical purpose of the mission. The jeweler is waiting for my call to confirm the liquidation. Make it look like a suicide. It's the ending he already scripted for me. James nodded, a sharp, professional gesture of approval. He reached for his comms. Alpha team status. Clean sweep, the voice replied. The documents are planted. The accounts are drained. Theresa walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. She heard the soft, clinical sound of a struggle behind her, the muffled gasps of a man realizing his time was up, but she didn't turn around. She was no longer a victim seeking closure. She was an architect of a new reality. "It's done," James said, appearing at her side. He didn't offer comfort, and she didn't seek it. He simply stood with her, two shadows against the glass. "The world is level, Theresa. Are you ready to see what's on the other side?" Theresa looked at her reflection. The shock and vulnerability were gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened strength. She wasn't free, but she was powerful. "I'm ready," she said, as they walked out of the penthouse together, leaving the ghost of Gary Kent behind in the glass cage. Theresa didn't look back. She had survived the freefall, and now she was the one who held the world in her grip. The morning that followed the erasure of Gary Kent was hushed, filled with the kind of heavy, expectant silence that precedes a total transformation. The secondary estate sat perched above the fog-shrouded Atlantic, its concrete walls absorbing the rhythmic, percussive beat of the waves. Theresa stood in the center of the war room, but for the first time, she wasn't looking at the monitors or the maps of the Vanguard's courier routes. She was looking at a small, unassuming black briefcase on the glass table. Inside were the components of a ghost: a passport from a country she had never visited, bank-encrypted keys to an offshore account funded by the recovery James had facilitated, and a series of legal documents that established a new identity, Elena Vane. It was a name that carried no history, no trauma, and no fingerprints. James stood by the window, his back to her, watching the sun struggle to pierce the gray horizon. He looked less like a commander today and more like a statue, his silhouette carved out of the morning light. He knew the weight of what was in that briefcase. It was the safe house he had promised, the ultimate shielding from a world that had tried to consume her. "The transport is waiting at the private airfield," James said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to sync with the tide. "The flight plan is filed. By sunset, Theresa C. Brown will officially be a memory. You'll have the resources of the firm at your disposal, and your first assignment in the Mediterranean is already being briefed to the local team." Theresa walked to the table, her fingers brushing the cool leather of the briefcase. She felt the gravity of the choice she had made in the penthouse. She had traded her fear for power, her isolation for a mission. But as she looked at the stoic mask reflected in the dark screen of a nearby terminal, she realized that the debt of honor James spoke of was a tether. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he had become the new gravity around which her world revolved. "You told me that luxury is never free," Theresa said, her voice steady and clear, carrying a resonance she had learned from him. "And you told me that I belonged to the mission." James turned slowly, his dark eyes searching her face. "That was the deal. I provided the walls, you provided the insight. Together, we've leveled a world that was tilted against you." "We did," Theresa agreed. She picked up the briefcase, but she didn't move toward the door where the tactical escort was waiting. Instead, she looked at the main server terminal, the heart of James's surveillance empire. "But while I was studying Gary's heartbeat, I started studying yours too, James. I learned how you move. I learned how you hide. And I learned that even a man who thrives on control leaves a trail." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the temperature seemingly dropping as the commander resurfaced in James's posture. He didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, Elena?" "I'm saying that I'm taking the identity," Theresa said, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm taking the resources. But I'm not taking the assignment. Gary taught me how to be a mark, and you taught me how to be an architect. But neither of you taught me how to be free. I had to learn that on my own while I was watching you watch the world." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one she had quietly mirrored from the war room's mainframe during the late-night training sessions. "This contains the handshake signatures for your private accounts, James. The ones you use to fund the dark justice that the Vanguard never sees coming. If I disappear into the mission, you'll always know where I am. But if I disappear into the world with this, we'll both be ghosts to each other." For a long, visceral moment, The silence was absolute. The man who had hauled her from the abyss stood across from the woman he had rebuilt, a predator staring at the mirror he had created. Theresa waited for the anger, for the tactical response, for the firm, bruising grip on her wrist. But it didn't come. James looked at the drive, then back at her. A slow, genuine expression crossed his face. Not the polished mask or the lethal hunger, but a flicker of something that looked remarkably like respect. He realized that he hadn't just built a partner. He had built a successor who had surpassed his own rules. "You were always the structural weakness, Theresa," James said softly. "I just didn't realize you were mine." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. He didn't reach for his headset. He didn't signal the guards. He simply watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. "If you do this, there is no safety net, no firm, no guards. You'll be standing on the edge of the world entirely on your own. I've spent my life being protected by men who wanted to own me," Theresa said, walking past him toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed with a newfound weight, a rhythm of pure autonomy. "I'd rather be cold and alone than warm in a cage." She stopped at the threshold, looking back at the man who had changed the axis of her life. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, the words a final, ironic echo of the past she was leaving behind. James didn't answer with words. He gave her a single, sharp nod, the salute of one ghost to another. Theresa walked out of the brutalist estate and into the blinding white light of the morning fog. She didn't go to the private airfield. She walked toward the coast road, the briefcase heavy in her hand, the salt air filling her lungs with a clarity that was terrifying and beautiful. Behind her, the sea continued its endless, indifferent roar, but she didn't look at the water. She looked at the road ahead, stretching out into a horizon that was finally perfectly level. Theresa C. Brown was gone. Elena Vane was a ghost. And for the first time in her life, the woman walking away was simply herself.